Hello, Charleston Conference. Welcome to our presentation. When is a magazine not a magazine? E-resources licensing and academic discovery. My name is April Hines, and I'm the Journalism and Mass Communications Librarian here at the University of Florida. I've been in this position for 11 years now, and I serve all of the departments in the College of Journalism. So journalism, advertising, media production and management, and public relations. And I'm doing this presentation with my colleague Sherry Edwards, who's going to introduce herself.
Thank you, April. Hi, everybody. I'm Sherry Edwards, and I'm the Electronic Resources Librarian here at the University of Florida. I've been in my role for about 2.5 years, and I manage a team of four very kind, highly skilled, and wonderful people. Welcome to our presentation. Before we get started, we would like to acknowledge that, along with everyone else using the Charleston conference organizers developed slides, we have included the code of conduct here. And then we have also included in our presentation the accessibility portion of our presentation. And so we recommend that if you have any questions about either the code of conduct or accessibility, that you contact the conference organizers.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I wanted to first talk about why non-academic serials, and we're putting that in quotes for a reason, which we'll talk more about in a minute, are really important to the departments I serve in the fields of public relations, advertising, journalism, and media production. My folks are really into what we would consider trade resources. And we're going to talk more about the official definitions of what those are, but resources that are targeted for professionals in certain fields. So I get a lot of requests for things like PR Week, Ad Week, Forbes, Broadcasting and Cable, which is another trade resource in the fields of media production. Of course, my folks are really into newspapers, digital, print, all kinds of formats. They're also really interested in business publications like Business Insider. So, some of my colleagues who serve other departments or colleges, like the English department or anthropology, for example, their folks are primarily interested in academic books and academic journals. Mine, however, are really interested in all these other types of what we consider non-academic sources. So resources like this are a big part of my work life. And because of all the shifts and changes in these types of resources, I spend a lot of time thinking about connecting my folks with resources like this. Um, Another reason why I've been thinking a lot about non-academic serials and what we consider trade resources is because trade journals have been really embedded in the curriculum here at UF. Our writing program has a series of classes called Writing in the Disciplines. So, for example, writing in strategic communication, writing in engineering, writing in business. And in these classes, they all have a trade journal assignment. And in this assignment, they have to find a trade journal in their field and they have to access it, follow it, write reflection papers bi-weekly, and I have to tell you that many students, when they get this assignment, they have no idea what a trade journal is. They have no idea how to access these types of resources. So myself and my colleagues here in the UF libraries have been getting a lot of questions. So trade journals have become a big part of my work life and trade resources, trade magazines, and the lines between what all that means. So I've really had to adapt to my thinking on these types of resources, how I use them, how I teach about them, and then how I connect users with them as a librarian. Now, what are some of the traditional characteristics and definitions of these types of resources? So this is a chart from North Carolina State University, which I love, which looks at format types. So when I'm doing an information literacy session as a librarian, I talk to students about, well, what's the difference between a scholarly journal, a popular magazine, or a trade magazine and journal? And we talk about, well, it depends on who the audience is, right? So a scholarly journal is, the audience is academics and professionals. You're not going to be reading the Journal of Food Science and Technology on the beach, or maybe some of you would, but generally not. But then you have popular magazines, which are geared towards the general public. You might pick one up at your, in line at your grocery store. And then you have trade magazines, which are written for people who work in a particular industry or business. Um, the author for a trade magazine is usually an industry specialist or a paid staff writer. And, there's also going to be a difference in editorial review. A scholarly journal is going to go through a peer-reviewed process with other scholars in that field. A popular magazine is going to be reviewed by professional editors who are paid, and same thing with a trade magazine and journal. And then, of course, you get into the philosophical conversation of, well, experts or specialist researchers are creating content for academic journals, but they're not getting paid, but it's part of their role. And it's always fun to have those conversations with students. And then, of course, there are other differences like length, whether they have references or not, how much they're charging. I think we all know that the Journal of Food Science and Technology is going to charge a lot more than Bon Appetit or Food Management. So, the lines used to be, pretty simple. A trade journal, we have an official definition here, is an essential, in-depth resource with specialist news geared towards a community of people that work in a particular industry or profession. And then a serial, which a trade magazine or journal is a serial, is defined as any publication issued in successive parts. And I was surprised by this line of, which are intended to be continued indefinitely, because we all know there are plenty of publications that cease. And these publications may be issued in print, non-print, or electronic format. And then, so what's the issue? We have clearly defined what a trade resource is versus a popular magazine versus, a scholarly journal or a newspaper. And the difference is what were traditional trade magazines or publications, like here we have the PR Week magazine that you would get either once a month or bi-weekly, in the mail. We would get it as a serial that would, come to the library and go on the shelf, or we would ingest the articles from that magazine into our databases like ProQuest or EBSCO. And that was a pretty simple, well-established process. But then in the last, I don't know, 10 years, um, over that period of time, we've started seeing this shift from print to platform. So even though PR Week, which is the #1 sort of trade resource in the field of public relations, if you were working in that field, then you know PR Week. Not every field has such an easily identifiable, top trade resource, but in public relations, they do. So now we have the PR Week web platform, which, PR Week still produces a magazine, but now we have a web platform that has articles that get updated almost daily. You have case studies, you have podcasts, you have webinars. So it's really more of a dynamic, ever-changing platform versus the static magazine container. And so what this does is it creates a situation where students are asking us, do you subscribe to my favorite trade resource? And in many cases, over the years, I've had to say, well, kind of, but not really. So, for example, Ad Age is another top trade resource in the field of advertising. And advertising is a field where you want to know what's happening now, like today. This is a very timely, ever changing, what are the current trends, what's on the horizon type of field. So when students and faculty come to me asking if we have access to Ad Age, and I tell them, well, we have access to the articles published in Ad Age's print magazine that get ingested into our ProQuest database, you know, every 2 weeks. And you can see, looking at this right now, I just grabbed the screen print yesterday. The most recent issue we have is October 7th. It's November 1st. So that student is going to look at that and go, well, that's not what I want. I want to get access to Ad Age articles that are coming out today. So the Ad Age that they want is the dynamic web platform that is behind a paywall. Again, the articles, the podcasts, the webinars, case studies, things like that. So it creates a situation where, yes, we have access to Ad Age, but not the one that you really want or the one that's really useful to you. And this has caused a lot of frustration in my work life for sure. And then we start having these philosophical conversations about, these trade resources that are becoming more robust every day. What are they? So, for example, this is WARC. I think WARC stands for World Advertising Research Center. This is something that my faculty begged me for. We have uh, a PR and communications agency that has real world clients out of the UFJ school. And it's staffed by students, but it's, monitored, run by faculty. And they really wanted this platform. This is something that's used very frequently in industry. So the WARC platform has award-winning case studies from all over the world on successful advertising campaigns. It has articles, like research articles from the Journal of Advertising Research. It also has articles written by analysts in the field. So you can see there's a feature on WARC called the feed. And here are articles that are updated daily, curated or written by WARC's editors. So if I was describing WARC to somebody, what would I call it? Is it a database? Is it a publication, a website, a platform? All I know is it's very expensive, $10,000 a year, and it's behind a paywall that we do pay for currently. And it has all of these different characteristics, so it's kind of hard to define. It does have articles written by journalists and editors, but then it has all these other features. So that's where these conversations can get kind of complicated. And for the students taking that writing in communications class, where they have to choose a trade publication to follow for the semester, would this satisfy their instructor's requirements? Would their instructor consider this to be a trade publication that would qualify? And that's where it can get kind of, the lines can be blurred.
And then beyond the definitions and characteristics of trade publications, um, in my role as e-resources librarian, I get into areas of navigating format, the delivery of the resource, um, pricing changes, pricing tiers, all the reasoning for pricing. So first of all, in terms of format and delivery, we see these online and everything that goes with that. So while it is convenient, easily updated, in a matter of a minute, if there's content to be added in the same day, we also see the challenges with that we don't get in print. So, as long as you have a working internet and the various tools that you need and the access authenticity to get there, which I'll discuss in a minute, online is okay, but these are are changes to format and delivery that are lending themselves to the characteristics of trade publications. Um, and then we see pricing changes, as I mentioned just now, in a variety of reasons for them. So, inflation, we hear that a lot. Production costs, we hear that a lot, though we can't seem to nail down uh, the vendors on what does that look like exactly? What kind of inflation? I often am tempted to go into uh, like Mergent Online, for example, to see, what costs are being reported here, if they are, just so we can, have that decision making at our fingertips. Um, and then we see how these vendors don't necessarily know what to charge us because they are not used to dealing with an academic audience. They're not used to dealing with academic institutions. Those two worlds, this trade publication world and then the academic world, which typically is dealing with scholarly resources, like journals, for example. They sort of collide. There's some overlap in that Venn diagram, but not a whole lot. And so I know we have an example of suggesting to a similar resource, this is what this other resource charges us. So why don't you all charge us that? Because they don't know what to charge us because they just don't deal with, our academic world often enough, I think, to really have a protocol and a workflow for that. Next slide, please. So, as far as negotiating the licenses that govern our, access and use to these resources, as I mentioned, that negotiation often falls within the ill knowledge of these resources, like RAPPRO, for example, that don't often deal with academic institutions. Also, negotiating can take a variety of forms. So we may negotiate directly with a vendor. If the resource is part of an overall collection, the statewide consortium might do that negotiation. The legalese in licensing agreements can sometimes I wonder if we should all have JDs because it is so crucial to be able to comb through these terms to make sure that, what we've agreed to is stated understandably in writing. This also can mean that trade publications require a little more nuanced terminology, and we have to compare, at least conceptually, with how trade publications view, access and subscriptions, authorized users, and other terms in the same way that the academic institution will, so that we know we are not violating those terms, and so that the trade publication also knows that we're not violating that. Um, and we also see within vendors the unfamiliarity with the term trade publication. And I think that can often spark these uncertainties and head scratchers in negotiations and even just in discussions about these licensing agreements, because many of us know what the terms are, especially in library world, while many people outside the library world and especially at a trade vendor don't. Next slide, please. So here we have an example of an agreement. This is a cut from work of an agreement that we have. And as you can see, there are really two areas here of interest. One is the number of products here over which to negotiate. And then also we see the a multi-year license. And so, as many of you know, that normally carries with it a lower percentage and dollar increase in years 2 and 3, because it's more economical. You get a deal when you buy in bulk, so to speak. That goes for a lot of products. And so, based on these and based on the activity that we undergo in order to manage all of these, and by we, I mean my team and I, um, I would assert that in the future, we just won't be able to afford all of these products associated with platform based trade publications because they get, more and more divided. They get more and more pieced out. And so April and I think that that leads to, are we really getting what we're paying for? That is an ethical question, which we are not addressing today. But if we say we subscribe to a trade publication, what do we really subscribe to? And I refer back to our slide, which asks, patrons ask, do we subscribe? And it's, well, kind of. So that is definitely something to keep in mind. Next slide, please. And so that gets us into various subscription models that we have. I'd say normally the vendors and platforms to which we subscribe, we do so by IP range. And that's just, basically understood. It's easy to forget that we don't. But on that note, there are times that we don't. And so we might get, for example, smaller scale options for our subscription models. So, a certain number at a time of simultaneous users. One that we have seen for work, for example, is 10 at a time users. And while we do get subscriptions based on IP ranges, that can also mean exposure to the campus. And so that is a selling point on its own. In other words, we're kind of advertising for this product on behalf of the platform vendor. But it also means very high prices for those that won't accept a smaller scale option. So in other words, it's either IP range or none at all. Whereas, uh, when we get into pricing, when we get into negotiation, a number of simultaneous users is very budget friendly, but it just doesn't always happen that way. But again, it's a cornucopia of various subscription models that we deal with on a case by case basis. Next slide, please. And so here are examples of, how we can access our subscription models. And so, as I mentioned, we do have these smaller scale options. Um, sometimes access also involves setting up email notifications, which you don't get, with print. So this can be a nice option for on the online versions. And we use two different access models. We use the VPN model, which we recommend here because you can zoom around for hours without having to sign in to see every single resource you're trying to access. We also have an easy proxy license that we pay for here. So people can do that. Normally recommended if you're just going to go in and get one thing or just have to sign into one trade publication like Adweek, Easy Proxy works fine for that. I do want to mention for those of you already who have already undergone Open Athens, the Open Athens transition, and those of us who haven't, and then those of us like University of Florida who are in the middle of it. Open Athens plays an important role here because there are those handful of we call them niche vendors, although I don't know that Adweek would be considered a niche vendor, but we could define trade publications that way. Those don't necessarily agree to undergo colloquially what's known as Athenization. And so, this can also cut into our ability to get rid of easy proxy altogether. That's kind of a different conversation, but something to keep in mind because if these, if Adweek, let's say, didn't participate in a federated search process such as Open Athens, it kinds of it adds a cost for us, not to necessarily the resource, but to the ability for our patrons to access it because we still have to pay for an additional license for that. So, there are these tertiary realities to consider when we're talking about, access, pricing, negotiation, and so forth. Next slide, please.
And I just wanted to add one thing, Sherry. I just
Sure.
wanted to point out that the ability to like PR Week to log in with your university email. What that does, like Sherry mentioned, is it allows you to get email newsletters that are produced by PR Week. And that's something that my people really wanted when they first came to me about, can we get access to PR Week? No, not the access you have, the access that we want on the platform. One of the things they mentioned was we really want to be able to get those email newsletters like the breakfast briefing, the weekend update, because again, in that field, what's happening right now or on the horizon is really important to them. So those email newsletters that come with a PR Week subscription were very important to them. And again, that's not anything that we've ever dealt with before when it comes to serials, publications, and subscriptions.
Yes, thank you, April. Very important point. And still moving on with access models, I have here an email with names redacted, um, and other identifying information that you can see if you take time to glance through it. This is a conversation we had with Rat Pro about, you know, um, number of users simultaneously. How are we going to do that? Will there be an IP address? So this is actual communication, with the representative there. And so this back and forth is, the conversation here reflects these questions that we're asking, where sometimes these things, they occur so naturally with, um, journal vendors that, as I said, we almost take them for granted. It's, you almost get into the script, you can predict what's going to be talked about. Not so with conversations like this. They're not necessarily tough or hard, but it is communication that has to be ironed out a little bit more than what you might expect so that we can get, on the same page and develop license terms, that both parties agree to. And then finally, on enhancing discoverability, um, one of the things that we know about trade publications is, and this is especially true if you are using the Primo discovery layer, is they don't um, produce results for what you might look for. So, for example, in the left side image here, if you type in this title into Primo, you'll get the result, no records found. But we do have them in a database. So, this does affect discoverability, where trade publication articles are concerned. One thing over to the left side of I'm sorry, on the right side image, that is a cut of our SpringShare software, or LibGuides, as we know affectionately. SpringShare does offer a facet of trade publications in the drop-down menu, as you can see. And so we're able to isolate our trade publications, in this case, Adweek, PR Week, and Rat Pro. So that does make, those databases discoverable. Same thing in EBSCOhost here, for the Business Source Premier database. There users can search according to trade publications. So discoverability is not necessarily 100%. Some third parties do acknowledge them, recognize them accordingly, which is very friendly to our users. But as far as the systems that libraries themselves use, that is not always the case. And we think discoverability is an important point in, this whole research project, because really what good is something if it's not discoverable? It needs to live and exist and be able to be found.
All right, so this is where I come in again. I had mentioned before that this really affects my information literacy instruction and, trying to explain to students, well, what type of resource are you looking at and how do you differentiate between platforms, between containers? And this is when we get into something that some of our colleagues over here in our science library, along with a larger team, they have been doing research for many years on something called container collapse. So what this means is that, when I was a student, it was really easy to know if I was looking at a magazine, a trade publication, an academic journal, a newspaper, because those all came in physical containers with cues that made it easy to differentiate between the different types of sources. But now, with so many resources only a screen away, and they're all appearing as just links on a screen. So, for example, I once had a student come to me at the research assistant's desk, and I said, I've only been able to find one thing on my topic. And she had a very academic niche topic. And she goes, all I've been able to find is this one website. And I was like, wow, that's kind of an interesting topic to have a website dedicated to it. And then when she brought up the website, it was actually an academic journal article. But as far as she was concerned, it was on her computer screen. She clicked on the link to get there. To her, that was a website. So having to explain to students that yes, these are all links on a screen, but these are all very different products from very different format types, and looking for those cues like who's the author, are there references, what is the source of information, and giving them different criteria to judge and evaluate what they're looking at to understand what container it's coming in, because it's just not as clear as it has been in the past. And this was a quote I took from one of their research papers on container collapse. Content consumers are format agnostic and that they do not care much what sort of container. Is this a book, a journal, a blog, or a web page? As far as they're concerned, if it's online, it is an online website or source. And then this gets into managing instructor expectations. So in the beginning of the presentation, I talked about how I had to manage instructor expectations who wanted their students to have access to the most recent content on these dynamic, expensive platforms that are coming out today, along with, email newsletters and all these other features, which come at a much higher price tag than, typical trade magazines or journals. So then I had to manage those expectations. And then we did end up purchasing access to some of the top, most requested platforms. Then I had the other end of the spectrum. This is a quote that I pulled from an email that I got from an instructor wanting to know why we didn't have more print versions of trade publications. So what we're seeing is after we spent 20 years, the last 20 years putting so many resources online, now we're getting more and more instructors that want their students to have that physical tactile experience of dealing with print resources. So this was an instructor that was like, I really wanted my students to compare different versions of hard copy trade journals, and sent his entire class to check out the latest issue of the trade journal of their choice. Problem was we don't have most of those resources in print. And the ones that we do have are not able to be checked out. It's only one copy of a certain publication, so there's not really a lot to go around. So then I had to manage instructor expectations on the other end of the spectrum. So, there's a lot of different needs and expectations, and, it's a spectrum. And it's sort of like an identity crisis, right? Like we think that it's very straightforward, but it's not. So this was a tweet that I put out last year because I have been thinking a lot about this. And I said, so here's a fun question for you. Is a publication still a publication if it no longer has volumes or issues, either in print or electronically? Many trade resources and popular mags are going this route. Many of the popular magazines that I grew up reading no longer even have a print version anymore. It's all on their web platform. So when I say that to students, I've had several of them say to me, "Oh, that's not a publication; it's a website." Right? Like they're in the writing for strategic communication class, they know they have to find a trade publication. And when I say, okay, well, here's Adweek, they go, well, this isn't a publication, it's a website. Again, going back to the container collapse, format agnostic, issues. So you can see that this tweet got over 11,000 views. It really generated a lot of interest and discussion. And these are people who are, librarians, practicing journalists, journalism professors. And I just grabbed a couple of the responses, happy to share the complete thread with anyone who's interested. But you can see that it wasn't clear cut. There was some disagreement, there was some discussion. And you know, some people said, oh, I would say it was a website, or oh, well, I would still consider it a publication, even if it is, or a website can be a form of a publication. Then we have like a very technical, like metadata response here from a metadata librarian. Someone else who says, hey, if it's not numbered, if it doesn't have dated issues, you don't know when to expect the next release of information, then it's not journalism, it's just PR. Or, it's just, it was so fascinating to see the back and forth, the different ways people defined what is a publication, what is a serial, what is a website. It's not as black and white as we would think. And these are all, professionals in the fields of communications, information, and they were even struggling. So what are the future directions? Where is this going? What are we going to do with this identity crisis? So what Sherry and I have talked about is we think there's going to be a lot less serials in terms of monthly issued or bi-weekly issued magazines and trade publications, and more of these dynamic web platforms that have more than just articles, but again, podcasts, webinars. Wrap Pro even has screenings for films that you can watch on that platform. So yeah, very dynamic. And then, what does that mean though? Because if every trade resource or magazine is switching to these platforms that have so many more bells and whistles, and now we're going from $250 for an annual subscription to $5,000 for this platform, if every single one of these resources is making that leap with that big price change, that's not sustainable for us. There's no way that we could accommodate that. So, does that mean we're going to see more academic versions of these trade platforms? That maybe pare down to our needs and not have all the industry bells and whistles. And we have some examples of this, like Mintel Academic, for example, which is a market research database that has an industry version that's much more expensive and an academic version, or like marketresearch.com academic. Of course, I'm sure many of you know Nexus Uni, the academic version of LexisNexis is much different than the big industry LexisNexis that like the New York Times subscribes to. And then I'd like to see more of these smaller access options, like 10 simultaneous users, for example. There is a database that we have access to called Simmons, which is like a market research consumer data platform. And we only pay for 10 simultaneous users, and it's rarely ever a problem because there's not usually more than 10 students who are all running home at the exact same time to log on to Simmons. So do we really need to pay for a 50,000 user, campus license when there's these target populations on campus who are going to be using these resources? So, we're hoping to see more flexibility with pricing, with access options. Can there be platforms that maybe they turn off these 5 features, but then turn on these 2 that are really beneficial to us at a reduced price? I'd like to see more flexibility. Okay, that's our presentation. So we are really looking forward to any questions that you have or any discussion. Thank you so much for listening. And I have our email addresses listed here. If you want to reach out to both Sherry and I, we're happy to keep the conversation going.